good morning. I am the training manager for the Office of Court Interpreter Services. So this is the office that provides interpreters directly from the trial court throughout the trial court. We'll do a little bit on my office a little later this morning, because like Mariah said, we have a full schedule. You have in your packets two things that I sent for you. One is the printout of the PowerPoint, and the other one is a handout, and the handout will expand a lot on what we say because we're going to have to read through some things. I'm hoping that we have time for question answer, so just don't let me know if you have a question, because sometimes I forget. So you should alert me. So first of all, as program manager for interpreter services, my role is, among all the other things that we do as trial court employees, to recruit interpreters to have on our list to provide to the whole court system, and to do our best to screen them appropriately, to train them, and then to work on the assigning of interpreters. Let us then focus today on what are professionally trained court interpreters. What are the skills? What are some of the challenges that they face? And as we talk, what I want you to, or I would ask you to do, is to really think why it is so important to have professionally trained interpreters in court. Well, everywhere, in the medical, in the community, in court, everywhere. But let's focus now in the court system. And just to make this point clear, because I know sometimes there is a confusion, in the field, now in the profession, there's a distinction between an interpreter and the translator. You know what the distinction is? So a translator, what does a translator do?
Written documents.
The written documents. So is transferring a language, from transferring messages, but one is in the written and the other one is in the oral or sign language modes. I don't know much about sign language interpreting. I know there's going to be a colleague talking to you about it. So basically, think of those issues there. Why should, or can any bilingual interpreter, any bilingual person act as an interpreter? What are the skills? What are the risks of not using trained people? And later we'll answer this question. Is the court interpreter's role to make sure that the limited English-speaking parties understand the legal process? Think about it, and then we can go back to that one later. Now, in terms of what is the definition of court interpreter in Massachusetts, that definition we take from two sources. One is Chapter 221C of the Massachusetts General Laws, and then from that law, we then created a document that we call the Standards and Procedures of the Interpreter's Office. And in those sources, a court interpreter is defined as a communication facilitator who needs to understand clearly his or her role in order to provide linguistic access, and has to understand the complexities of the issues and the tasks at hand. Okay. So that's Chapter 221C. Just wanted to point out that in the original language of the law, they wrote citizens, but then for the standards, we changed that into persons. I mean, we don't have no importance to us. We assign an interpreter when it's requested through the court system. We don't ask for documentation. And there you have the online address, and that's important because later we'll talk about a list of interpreters that we have there in case anyone needs it. Now, so Section 4 of the standards, and here's where we are going to go into what is a court interpreter, has a code of conduct for court interpreters. All right? And as part of the code, these are let's say this is the skeleton of the code of conduct for interpreters. When you go to the code, each one of these entries is discussed. The interpreter is given a guideline on how, what does that mean, and there's a commentary. Now, if we flush 5 very important points that are the ones that I want you to really think about: accuracy, impartiality, confidentiality, avoidance of conflict of interest, and proficiency. So let me go very quickly through them, and then we'll see why they are not that simple. So accuracy for interpreters, like everyone knows in any type of interpreting scenario, accuracy for interpreter is a key factor. Now, when it comes to court interpreting, it has a very specific meaning, because contrary to, let's say, conference interpreting, where the interpreter can eliminate certain things, if the diplomat is kind of self-doubting or chuckling or whatever, they eliminate that. When a court interpreter goes to the witness stand, the court interpreter doesn't choose what to eliminate. Court interpreter cannot eliminate anything. Court interpreter needs to make the best effort to transfer what the speaker said so that the listener listens to it as closely as possible as how the speaker said it, without omitting, without cleaning up, without improving, none of that. Now, that, believe it or not, is accomplished less than you might think. Because if we think of languages, we all know that two languages are not mirror images of each other. So you don't pluck a word out and replace it. That doesn't work like that. So the interpreter has to be doing all of those analytical decisions in her or his head. And sometimes the results are better than others. Now, impartiality is crucial, because a court interpreter is not there to assist Mary or Jane or Judge X or Attorney B or District Attorney F. The court interpreter is there for the process. That's the loyalty of the court interpreter. So when we assign an interpreter, that interpreter should be able to move around the process for anybody who needs that interpreter, even in the same case for the defense and the prosecution. So imagine how important is even the appearance of impartiality in those contexts. And the same we can just go right ahead and say for confidentiality. Everybody should feel completely comfortable that nothing is going to be discussed outside of the realm, the sacred realm of that interpreted encounter. Avoidance of conflict of interest. There's a list in our code of what constitutes real conflict of interest and a perceived conflict of interest. An interpreter has to avoid both types. Proficiency goes without saying. Linguistic, analytical, legal, you name it. And of course, those things take a lot of learning and training. And a little caveat here. In my office, we don't have any money. They hired me, and the first question that they asked, well, how can you train without any money? And I thought they were kidding, and little did I know. So that's one of the challenges that we have, and we'll go into that a little later because I want to caution you about something. Now, here, just let's think of these three challenges. When a court interpreter goes to work, especially when they're new, unfamiliarity with terms, with a process, the whole issue that we discussed, that there's no such thing as word for word translation or interpretation. And then all kinds of inappropriate requests that always stem from a lack of understanding of what is there, of what the interpreter is there for. So interpreters all the time have to be educating the users of their services as well. Okay? All right, accuracy. So like I said, no omitting, no improving, no adding, no cleaning, no simplifying. So it's a transfer of content, of message. And the message also has to be transferred as closely as possible as the speaker says it. Because if someone is testifying at the witness stand, there's a jury or a judge making a judgment on that person and how the person communicates. So for instance, and let's think of this example. If an attorney asks, if I were to ask you who was your treating physician in the intervening period between or prior to your second accident, what would your response be? So if the interpreter translates that as this, who was your doctor before your second accident, that constitutes summary. That's not accurate interpreting from the standpoint of the court. Can a Somali interpreter or a Japanese interpreter or a German interpreter all come up with a realist or a Spanish interpreter transference from this? Well, some will be able to achieve it better than others. But this is not accuracy for court interpreters. Now, another challenge. There's no such thing as equivalence among, between legal systems. So for instance, Gay Gentis, the manager in my office, found this example of how a Hmong interpreter in court would have to handle arraignment. So, that's great because sometimes in the court when they are speaking very fast and the interpreter is interpreting simultaneously, the Hmong interpreter is still finishing one word and the clerk is already in the next case. So that happens pretty often. Now, okay, this is something that I want you to remember as attorneys and, advocates. When you work with interpreters, these are all very problematic. Because as you know, jokes, insults, idioms, all of those things are very culturally specific. They don't necessarily translate well. And if you add to that the issue that many of the interpreters who come here are themselves not raised in this culture, so they really don't know. So if I would give you a piece of advice, avoid that. And the same with, I had somewhere acronyms. I thought I had it here, so we can add acronyms here. If you use an acronym, then express it, Anybody else can think of anything else that would be problematic to interpret? Do you see why this could be challenging? Okay? Legalese. I mean, if a new interpreter or an untrained person goes into court and hears Ms. Chan was violated, I bet you they're going to translate as Ms. Chan was? Absolutely. So Ms. Chan is going to come out of there thinking that she was raped, So that's why, again, avoid legalese as a practice as much as possible when an interpreter is involved. Interpreters often operate with no access to preparation, which is a disaster, and we're trying to change that. So they don't have any context. It is common for interpreters to go through the door in the courtroom. Everybody's ready. Attorneys have, studied their cases, the judges. Everybody's ready. The interpreter walks in and the clerk announces triumphantly, "The interpreter is here. We are ready." And if the interpreter were to hear any of these, the interpreter wouldn't know for sure. What are there boring people or involved, or someone should avoid something? Was that a drug dealing thing or something? I don't know. So that's why good professionally trained interpreters have no choice but to keep raising their hands and requesting clarification. Some languages have ambiguity in them, and those of you who speak Spanish would know that because of the way you can start a sentence without the specific subject, if you hear this outside of a context, you don't know which one of these it means. See, that's why interpreters, again, have to continue to ask when they haven't had access to preparation. Okay, so for you, based on what we have just said here, if a court interpreter heard any of these utterances, and a judge says, interpreter, you should interpret word for word. We hear that a lot of, all interpreters roll our eyes, word for word. So what do you think would happen? Do you think the person, the LEP party, would understand? Let me tell you something. When I do my introductory training, I always use this one, the famous green monster. And I can tell you, I'm not a sports fan, but my husband is, so I know what the green monster is, and I have lived here enough. But we have interpreters from countries that normally, they don't do baseball. They do soccer. So if you add to that they were not raised here, they have no clue. Without an exception, every single time I try these with a new interpreter, they think it's a god of envy or anger. Without an exception. The green, the vile, something, I don't know. They kind of, so, I mean, maybe it would be better to say something like the green wall at Fenway Park. This one happened in real life to us. An interpreter told me that the probation officer used that one, and the interpreter realized that she couldn't just say it like that. And the one with the lazy Susan, someone interprets that word for word, they're going to think that there's a woman, who's named Susan, who's lazy, and who hid a gun in her body. You know? And this one I like because if you think about it, if you were to ask your client, were you upset or was he upset? In your mind, you would be thinking either, were you? What? If you ask someone, were you upset? What are the two choices? Angry is one, or sad, even nervous. So a good interpreter should always ask for clarification on a question like that. Counsel, Your Honor, may counsel clarify the meaning of upset in this context, you know? Just to make sure. So again, remember, it's not a bad thing when an interpreter asks for clarification. It's not that the interpreter doesn't know his or her job. On the contrary, it's that the interpreter knows his or her job. So, okay, here's the thing. The question was, what if the interpreter is using these very formal terms? Well, let me explain it like this. If the attorney is using formal language and you're working for anyone, and you're working with a professionally trained interpreter, the interpreter needs to preserve that same level. So it is up to the speaker to lower or to explain. But the interpreter, court interpreters cannot do that.
Okay.
So if you want the person to hear it in simple plain English, then you have to say it in simple plain English. Impartiality. Okay, let's go into the scenario. The interpreter you are now working with, that interpreter had been in court that morning, and it just happened that interpreter was working in the case that now you have in front of you in your office. This is theoretical. So that interpreter hears in front of you the LEP party say something that contradicts what that person had said in the morning. Question, should the interpreter alert you to that or no? Yes or no?
No.
No. No. Because that's not the interpreter's role. That is not the interpreter's role. No? The interpreter is there to just simply convey what is said at the meeting. It's not there to be the, beacon of whatever, Okay? So don't ever get upset at an interpreter if the interpreter doesn't say. I have been, as an interpreter, with people who, I'm from Puerto Rico, and I was once with this person who is clearly from the Dominican Republic. I know. And the person was telling the attorney that he was from Puerto Rico. I just had to, keep going. That was not my business. Okay? Now, confidentiality. After assisting you and your LEP client, the interpreter is approached by a relative, basically outside of the court, and this relative says to the interpreter, oh, I'm so-and-so, I'm related to the person you were working with. Can you tell me what was discussed in there? Because I want to be involved in helping that person. No. And no. Actually, even an interpreter even stopping to give that person the time could be construed by a passerby as the interpreter talking to that person. And there comes the appearance of a lack of impartiality. So, interpreters have to be very careful. Now, another thing about professionally trained interpreters are the skills. And again, these are not part of being bilingual. You can be bilingual, but you don't necessarily know how to interpret simultaneously or consecutively, or even do side translation. If you want, one day, just those of you who are bilingual, just take any article and try to do an oral translation of the text, and you'll see how much it takes. Are you familiar of when interpreters use each mode? Okay, then let's go into that. Consecutive interpreting, speaker speaks, interpreter transfers into target language responds, that is now the source language, back to the first language. So it's a two-way, no? And it's usually done in contexts such as meetings with your clients, in a conference room or something like that at the doctor's office, like Sarita will present into medical and sorry, in the afternoon. The other big moment for consecutive interpreting is, of course, at the witness stand. And it's the voice of the interpreter. The interpreter's rendition is the record, not what the person said in his or her language. So imagine the responsibility. And usually interpreters, well, they should always have a notepad. There's a whole theory on note-taking for interpreters that are symbols or what have you. And they should try to preserve everything the person said. If the person says, well, let me see, I'm not sure, the interpreter should be able to bring that back in the interpretation. I brought this here because these are ASL interpreters, American Sign Language, and they usually work in teams. And that team interpreting is absolutely recommended for any trial where there's witness examination to avoid the interpreter's proneness to errors, which happens, as it has been studied, even without the interpreter realizing it. So we are trying now to move towards team interpreting whenever possible, and to train the courts and the interpreters on how to do it appropriately. Now, simultaneous interpretation is that interpretation that usually you don't hear about. That's when the interpreter is next to the person, just whispering whatever is being said in English into the person's language. So at an arraignment, at motion where the person is sitting at the defense table. See, this is one of our interpreters, our Chinese interpreters, Garqiang. Okay. And then the third mode is the side translation that I was telling you, that is like an oral translation of a written document that the interpreter scans through it and then tries to do it. It's, of course, more difficult when it's a legal, a legal document. It's easier if it's just a letter or something like that. Okay? Questions so far? Questions? You have consecutive and simultaneous. Now you know that difference, no? Okay. Both are difficult. Both make the interpreter mentally tired after only half an hour of non-stop, because you're doing all kinds of things in your head. And then, of course, in the courtroom, the acoustics is the interpreter's enemy, because there's none of it, and it's horrible. So they're working hard. So, going back to the initial question, is any bilingual person apt to just stand up and interpret? Now, I guess that we can say no. Not in a formal professional level, no? And that's, I think, for you to keep always in mind. Now, they need the specialized training in legal terminology, interpreting skills and modes, and the ethical standards. And that involves learning and training. When we screen, since we don't have a lot of leeway for training or money or resources, what I try to do is do my best in bringing in the best people I can find. Now, as you may imagine, in languages such as Chinese, Spanish, Portuguese, where there's so many people available, you have more room to be choosy. But then when you come to the languages of lesser diffusion, the small communities, that there are not many people, sometimes we don't find the ideal candidates, but then we try to do our best with those that we bring in. But it's not necessarily going to be the same. Besides, they don't get that much of a chance to work in court, so they don't get a chance to develop the skills. So keep that in mind also. So we, ay Maraya, una vez más. Perdóname. So we test them, we interview them, we bring them through intro training, we mentor them with the observation, and then for the certification, because we have screened interpreters and certified interpreters. The certified interpreters have to take other tests, hopefully oral when we have them, and operate at a level that we think they are ready for a trial, basically. The dangers of working with a With an untrained interpreter, of course, they will not understand the concept of accuracy. They will start or may start intervening because they see themselves as advocates. Court interpreters are not advocates in that sense. You know, they're advocates of the legal process, if you will, of due process, but not of anyone, any party in particular. So untrained interpreters may not know this. You don't know if they're going to talk about the case to someone else. You don't know. Probably they will not be familiar with terms, with modes of interpreting. So you're working at a different level at that point, and you will have to intervene more, probably. I think that's what will happen. So the court interpreter's role, based on what we have said, is it to make sure that the person, the LEP person, understands the process? How could we improve this statement? The role of the court interpreter would be to make sure that the LEP party, instead of understand,
Receives.
yes,
Receives
hears, no? And by hearing what is being said, then participates. And also to make sure that he or she can communicate verbally. Who is in charge of making sure the person understands?
The speaker?
Yeah.
The applicant.
The attorney, the judge, the probation officer, the clerk. That's, and again, this is a theory of court interpreting. Now, so again, to make sure they enable the LEP parties to hear everything and to communicate with English-speaking parties during their legal process. They are not just physically, but they're mentally, linguistically, intellectually, to the best of everyone's ability. No. Basically, the way it is set in the field is that the interpreter tries to bring the LEP party at the same level. Of course, many interpreters will say that's not going to happen altogether, but to try, you know? Now, how to make the best of the situation when you're working with interpreters? In your handout, and I think the PowerPoint presentation, now there are a series of slides that say do, and don't. Let's skip those for now. Let's go to the Office of Court Interpreter Services. We call it OCIS. And Mariah wanted you to know certain things about our office. So let me just comply with that, and then we can go to the other part. And by the way, we are at 2 Center Plaza, right there across from City Hall, 9th floor, in front of the Suffolk Superior Court. We provide interpreters throughout the whole Commonwealth, including the islands. Not easy. So like I said, we screen, we do our best in training, we monitor, we assist the courts, we assist the interpreters, we do the daily grinding business of dealing when an interpreter is not available because has an accident, how do we replace it? Here the angry attorneys and lawyers and judges, where's my interpreter? So we do all that from there. And by the way, I had a slide of us. I think in my office we are 10 people. And some of them are fiscal. So we have pretty much 3 people in the front and then 3 schedulers. And we deal with the whole state every day. These are figures from 2004, but for the most part, they more or less reflect today's reality. Maybe the difference is that Mandarin has gone up, and Cantonese also up. But look at the difference here. You know, pretty much 3/4 of what we do is Spanish in Massachusetts. Polish has gone down a little bit, same as Russian. And ASL is here, just so you know, because our office receives a request from the court for an American Sign Language interpreter. What we do, our database connects to their database. We transfer that request to the Mass Commission, thank you. And they're the ones who deal with everything else, and we pay for it. But we don't know anything about how they choose their interpreter, who they send, we don't know anything. But we get the request, okay? All right. Now, these are some of the recent languages that we have been challenged with. And I tell you something, it's not easy to find interpreters in many of the smaller communities, mainly because they're small communities, they all know each other, some of them or many of them still have not been completely acculturated, they still have not gone through professional training in any academic subject. So we're dealing with issues of proficiency, of issues of confidentiality, because maybe, and especially if they come through refugee programs, they came together. They all know each other. So we always alert people who use interpreters to clarify any issues of confidentiality or privacy at that level. We have 25 staff interpreters, as you may imagine, mostly in Spanish, then Cambodian, or Khmer, Portuguese, Vietnamese, one Haitian, Creole, and then otherwise we work with per diem, with contract interpreters, who are very loyal, very devoted. Some of them are almost like staff interpreters at this point, in over 40 different languages. Okay. Here's a Grebo. Over 33 different dialects of Grebo. And finally, I remember we found one Grebo speaker who was a mathematician, but then he spoke one type of Grebo, and then we found this guy who was an adorable guy, but he didn't have, he had a high school level education, couldn't understand the process, so it was very challenging. How are interpreters requested? Okay, so just so you know, there are different ways. Traditionally, it is through a person who is usually a clerk, who is our court liaison. So if you go to any clerk's office and you ask who's a person who requests interpreters, that's how you can identify that person. Some of them like that job better than others. So I warn you. Now we have mass courts, that database that you type in that the person needs an interpreter, and that continues at every step of the way, and it is connected to our system, so we get it directly through that database. So that has been already in use at the district, probate, housing courts. I think juvenile is also on it, or it's about to. Superior, not yet. You can go to our website and you'll see a list of our interpreters by language and either screened or certified. And you can certainly just contract the services of those interpreters privately if you need to. Our office provides phone interpreting, so please, if you're in court and you have an emergency situation, please ask the clerk to get to our office. We can try to provide phone interpretation at that moment. And we try to use our interpreters first. If our interpreters are not available, then we go to language line. But please, please, please remember that, okay? Even at least for an initial communication, all right? And that was well, it doesn't show here, but you have it. You have our website. And let me just also tell you, it's not that we don't believe that we should send interpreters to all of the, associations or organizations, to the DAs, to CPCS. We do, but we're not funded for it. We lost the funding, actually, for CPCS and the DA's office some years back. But unfortunately, now we have our hands tied. Okay. In the standards and procedures, it lists what do we assign interpreters for. And basically, criminal and civil. Don't let any courts tell you that we don't assign for civil. We've told them and they don't believe us. Criminal and civil proceedings in front of a judge, a clerk, a magistrate, any court-mandated investigation, like for GALs, if the juvenile court or the probate court needs an attorney to go to a house to conduct an investigation, they should request an interpreter from us. Okay? For mental health evaluations, commitment hearings, the Lindemann Center or something like that, that sort of thing. Court clinic, grand jury proceedings, we do. And again, the dollar sign is there to, again, to stress the fact that that's what we are funded for. We assign interpreters for all this, but of course, if we have to assign a priority, we'll send it to a criminal first, or to a 209A matter. But we do. Divorces, small claims, malpractice, personal injury, clerk magistrate hearings, civil trials. We do not assign interpreters for attorneys to interview their clients, except for the, the consultations outside of the courtroom throughout the morning, for sure. That will happen. We don't assign them to the district attorneys. We don't do translations or tape transcriptions. No development of evidence, and no probation visits at court. Now, if it's part of the probationer's process that morning, for sure, the interpreter goes from the courtroom to the probation office. But we don't get requests from the probation department per se. And in terms of the do's and don'ts, we're going to go into that this afternoon. But let me just, and you have that, both in the handout and in the PowerPoint presentation. Basically, let me stress a couple of factors. First of all, any interpreted encounter will last longer, regardless of the level of proficiency of that interpreter. So you have to just go in there with that understanding and patience. It's a good idea to allow a few moments to let the interpreter set up. For example, like what is your name?
Richard.
What Richard was asking, well, what if they don't understand each other? Well, sometimes it's a good idea for the interpreter to test that when they speak to each other, they understand, for whatever reason, no? But also, the interpreter should take a couple of seconds to tell to the LEP party, I am the court interpreter, I am here as an impartial person, and I am going to say everything that you say and everything that is said to you. And this is confidential. Just that, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. And that's a good idea. Also, the setup of the room. Always, and we're going to go into that this afternoon, try to, in your meetings, try to, if the interpreter doesn't do it first, try to let the interpreter sit in a way where you have direct contact with your client, because you are the one conducting the interview, not the interpreter. So always, keep that in mind. Avoid those long, convoluted sentences, long acronyms. Avoid acronyms, avoid jokes. They're going to make the process more difficult. Don't expect the interpreter to know every legal term. I remember years ago, and to this day I don't know if that was Veronica that happened to me with. If it wasn't you, it was someone that for some reason reminds me of you. That I remember she handled, maybe Veronica did, but she handled the use of fresh complaint. At that time it was still called fresh complaint so well, because she wanted her client to know that term, to hear fresh complaint. So she told me, okay, I'm going to use the term fresh complaint. You say it in English, and then I'll explain it. And that worked beautifully. So I was saying, sí, usted va a la corte para un proceso de fresh complaint. Fresh complaint is blah, 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 blah. And that person got that benefit. And the attorney, took charge of that, and that was excellent. So that's something that you can do. You should monitor the situation. An interpreter should not engage in private conversations with the LEP party. There shouldn't be any other than the interpreting. If there is, you certainly can intervene and ask what is going on. If someone made a mistake, you can intervene and then make the amends that are necessary. And one more thing, quickly. Some people, English speakers in court, think that if they speak loud, the person will understand English. No. If anything, speak clearly and slower when an interpreter is present. Effort. Everybody everybody involved in a team, in an interpreted encounter has to be ready to cooperate so that it works. Well, thank you so much. And you have our number, really. Call if you need to. Okay? Thank you so much, Leonor. Thank you.